Ah, I think we're good, huh? Okay, great. Well, as you guys can tell, I'm not Jeff. He had to be out of town on business this evening, so you've got me tonight. But I wanted to welcome everybody. A good meeting. Let's see. I gotta take a look at my agenda here. First of all, I want to thank Debbie Arnold for bringing the refreshments tonight. Be sure to help yourself afterwards. Yeah, it's nice to have some goodies, and we do like to have just a little bit of goodies. We don't have every month covered, so I'm going to pass around the sign-up sheet once again. And if you haven't signed up and think you might be able to just bring a little something to help make our evenings a little bit more fun, we appreciate it. Okay, first we're going to just do a little bit of business here. I'll start by having our recording secretary, Leslie Wilson, read the minutes from last month's meeting.
Okay. Old Mecklenburg Genealogical Society meeting minutes, February 13, 2019. The meeting was called to order at 7:25 p.m. with 30 members and guests in attendance. There were no minutes read since the December meeting was an informal gathering and the society did not meet in January. It was noted that society membership is now 252 and that about 60 members have not yet renewed their membership. President Jeff High thanked the members who provided refreshments this month and reminded attendees of the refreshment sign-up sheet for future months. He also remarked that the Charlotte Museum of History will celebrate the city's African American heritage from noon to 4 p.m. on February 23, and our society's research center will be open during that time. Heather Angelino, who presented the July meeting program on the Melungians, shared her new discovery which revealed an additional Melungian ancestor. The evening speaker was Robert E. Wells, Jr., who presented an interesting and informative talk on DNA and also answered attendees' questions. He provided information on who and why people should have a DNA test and gave several ways the test can help individuals with their genealogy, including help in getting through brick walls and determining a person's true biological lines. He said that the 4 main companies who provide DNA tests are Ancestry, Family Tree, MyHeritage, and 23andMe. He also explained the 3 types of DNA tests, which are Y-DNA, autosomal, and mitochondrial. Mr. Wells also explained how DNA is passed down through the generations and shared his opinion that DNA will be the future of genealogy since it complements and validates research individuals have already done. He feels we owe it to future generations to make sure that our research is as accurate as possible. The meeting was adjourned at 8:30 p.m. Respectfully submitted.
Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes? Okay, then let's be official. All in favor of accepting them? Aye. It's done. Okay. We have a number of guests here tonight. Not everybody signed in, but the couple that I do have are Wally Poole. Wally, right there. Yeah, welcome, Wally.
Thank you.
Yeah, glad to have you. Hugh Dusick. Hugh here, also a local historian. And I know Dawn brought her husband Keith. And anybody else?
This
Yes?
is a friend of mine, Rodney Reed, and his sweet wife, Margaret Ann, over there.
Rodney and Margaret Ann.
Yeah, I'm the historian for the Cowpens Chapter of Sons of American Revolution.
Excellent. Wonderful.
And
Good.
we have been on the campus at 7 o'clock, but we...
I'm so sorry. It's a little bit tricky to find us sometimes. I apologize.
It's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, that's great. Well, welcome to everyone. We're glad to have you. Our membership secretary, Marilyn, hasn't arrived, so I don't have a exactly up-to-date membership report, but I do believe from having checked it recently that we still have about 40 people from last year's membership who did not renew for this year. And so, unfortunately, you know, at some point we have to drop them. So if you know somebody who hasn't sent in their check yet, let them know. But we have something around 211 members at this point, so that's pretty good. The only other item of business that I really have here is to announce the upcoming event of the Voices from the Past for this year that many of you are probably familiar with. This is the third year that the Mecklenburg Historic Association is sponsoring that cemetery stroll through Settlers, Elmwood, and Pinewood cemeteries. If you haven't been, it's just a really unique, interesting event, and it's really fun to see these people come alive and hear their stories. So check that out. It's on Saturday, April 6th this year, and it's from 1 to 4 in the afternoon. So you can check out our website or the MHA website to hear more about that if you're interested. Anybody have any other business information that we need to talk about before we get going with the big event? Okay, well, we are very, very lucky tonight to have with us a voice from the past. General Nathaniel Greene, the commander of the Southern Forces in the American Revolution, is here with us, some 239 years after he was last in Charlotte. And he will speak to us about the important role of Mecklenburg County in some parts of the American Revolution. Now, of course, we know that General Greene is coming to us in the form of our own John Meisenheimer, whom most of you are familiar with from having been an integral member of our society for a long time. But just to let you know why John is qualified to represent General Greene, let me just read some things here about John's background to let you know. John has actually started being interested in genealogy much earlier than many of us. He started in college when he went to Pfeiffer College, which is located in Meisenheimer, North Carolina. And you can understand the connection there. So he began looking into his Meisenheimer relatives, and at some point discovered that his direct ancestor, Abraham Meisenheimer, was a Continental soldier under the command of none other than General Nathaniel Greene in the American Revolution. So that obviously piqued his interest and his focus on the Revolutionary era. And Abraham Meisenheimer was in what is now Cabarrus County, was at the time Mecklenburg County. So this is all very local and very close to home in John's family. And in the meantime, John has also identified by name 17 direct male ancestors who were soldiers in the American Revolution, and 1 female ancestor who is considered to be a heroine of the American Revolution. I assume that's a particular title that she earned as well.
Hero of the Revolution, heroine.
Heroine, right, yeah.
And she
So,
did earn.
so he's got some really strong revolutionary roots, and I think that tells the story right there. And just in general, John is very active in many genealogical and historical organizations. He's presently president of the Lieutenant Colonel John Pfeiffer chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. He's vice chairman of the Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission. He's on the board of the Historic Cabarrus Association, and the list, as you can see, goes on. He's really done a lot of history related things in the area. He has helped organize the Spirit of the Hornet's Nest reenactment at Rural Hill and the Battle of Collins Ford reenactment as well. So this impersonation and reenactment is not new to John. He's been involved in helping to publish a number of historical publications, including the Cabarrus Heritage Book, the Old Mecklenburg Heritage Book, the Cabarrus Revolutionary Patriot Roll, the Gaston County Heritage Book, and all of this has come together, which allowed the North Carolina Society of Historians to award him the North Carolina Historian of the Year award. So he's got credentials. That's great. I think we know that we're in for a real treat tonight, and without further ado, I present General Greene.
Thank you, Lynn. I appreciate it very much. This feels like I'm actually coming home because, like Lynn said, practically as soon as I got out of college and graduate school at Appalachian and Pfeiffer, I joined the Old Mecklenburg Genealogical Society. And I told Lynn on the way in, she probably recognizes me again, because I know y'all see I have a wig now. You know I don't really underneath that, but my hair back then, she knew me when I had hair for real. So anyways, but it is a real pleasure. Mecklenburg County is central in many ways to the story of the American Revolution, and a lot of credit needs to go to Mecklenburg and really the whole region, because this was considered the Salisbury Military District, and the map up here that I have displayed is the Mozon's map from 1775, and basically west of the Yadkin River, going all the way to Tennessee, comprised the Salisbury District of the North Carolina, and there were 20,000 soldiers, militiamen, that were in that. At the outbreak of the American Revolution, it was reported that General Griffith Rutherford, who was over the Salisbury Military District, had more soldiers under his command, now this is at the beginning of the war, than General George Washington had when he took command of the Continental troops up at Boston. So that is an impressive number, and when you consider the aspect of the American Revolution from the point of view, not just Mecklenburg, but North Carolina, the British originally had made an attempt to come to North Carolina early on, but they were going to come into Wilmington. I believe also it was General Cornwallis who was trying to make that effort and arm the Highlanders that were down what we call Fayetteville today, but it was Cross Creek then, and they ended up in the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge. And so you had troops, including from Mecklenburg County, because I had published an article in the Mecklenburg Heritage Book, were the Mecklenburg troops that went to assist with Morris Creek Bridge early on. So we basically put down the British efforts to come into North Carolina and into the South, and that deflected them to the north. And so we pretty much had a stable, peaceful environment from 1776 early on until about 1780 in the Carolinas, North and South Carolina altogether, because a lot of the efforts were going on up north. Early on in the war, General Greene is an interesting character. I am an interesting character. I'm trying to be first person, but it might not always work. So bear with me. I'll slide in and out of present and past. But he was a part of the peace churches as a Quaker, and they were not under English law required to fight. They were exempt from military service, going back I think into the 1600s. The point was he had no military training. His father had no military training. His father actually was a preacher. So if anybody had the least amount of predisposition to the military, it was General Greene. But he ends up being called the Fighting Quaker. And he went and bought his first musket. He was from Rhode Island, traveled down to Philadelphia, and bought it in Philadelphia. He was in his clothes with the brim hat and everything. He stuck it in the wagon underneath the hay to take home, so he didn't want people to know that he had already started buying some military supplies. But I think, from the perspective of the war, you can think of peace or you can think of liberty. And so I think those competing ideas, which are also both in the Bible, were part of the reason that he realized that America needed to be free, and liberty, I think, resonated with him like on the Liberty Bell. So that, I think, is kind of key to understanding how he switched from being a pacifist to supporting the war to, and he was very, very, very smart. I want to say that he was more like a sponge because he kind of soaked up everything. He would learn from everywhere and everyone what to do. But he read. He really read a lot of books, and he self-educated himself by reading a lot of military books and strategy. He equipped his men, but he had a limp when he was a young man, and so normally if you pay for all the equipment and everything, your men elect you as an officer. Well, they didn't think it was becoming an officer to have a limp, so he stayed a private, and he had outfitted his whole unit. But then when he went to the Boston and the siege of Boston, he very much distinguished himself with the military strategy and everything. So that caught the attention of Rhode Island, and he's the only person that I know went straight from the rank of private to general. Literally. Skyrocketed. Yes, indeed. But if you think about it, during the American Revolution, the British was the regular army, and also British officers, if I stand corrected, if I'm not, I know Hugh might mention, but I think they could buy their commission. And so it wasn't uncommon for someone who wasn't even necessarily in the military, if their family was an aristocrat and had enough money, they could, I want to be a colonel, okay, it costs this much money, and they would do that at the beginning of the war. But I think by the end of the war, the British realized that they needed to promote from within as well. But at the beginning of the war, I think they could buy their commission. So if you put that in the time frame, it's not unpractical that someone who was a private could become a general. But Greene distinguished himself and deserved that recognition, and I think that was bestowed upon him for that reason. And in Boston, he got the attention of General Washington. And so General Washington, Greene went in the state militia from private to a brigadier general, and then George Washington brought him on his staff, and he became a major general, at least by the end of the war. And so Greene and Washington are really the only two generals that I think, if I'm not mistaken, served the whole time of the American Revolution. Other people were promoted at different times, but I think they are the only two that actually have continuous service from the beginning to the end of the war as generals, apart from being private briefly. So I give you that background so you can kind of appreciate Greene, but he was always George Washington's right-hand man. And so for that very fact, he was George Washington's pick to come to the South. But the Continental Congress, and I don't know, come to present, current Congress, I don't know, they kind of debate things all the time and try to select things, not necessarily what the leaders or George Washington wanted at the time or the present. So anyways, sticking to George Washington though, they had General Benjamin Lincoln in Charleston. And General Benjamin Lincoln, I think he was a pretty fine general, but the Charlestonians persuaded him to stay in Charleston a bit too long. And by May, and now I'm coming south, early part of the war, but we got to come south. He stayed in Charleston, and Lord Cornwallis and General Clinton both encircled Charleston, and they waited too long before they could have escaped. They had plenty of time because the siege started in December of 1779 when they landed on, I think, down towards John's Island. And and then worked their way around till May of 1780. So you have a good 5-6 months there that at some point they had plenty of time that they could have left, is my point. But they were trying to hold the port of Charleston, which was a very important location, considering that, it would give the British Navy the means to bring supplies, soldiers, and everything in. So holding that place was a strategic importance as well. So it wasn't necessarily, but they did wait too long. But General Benjamin Lincoln had to surrender. Now, just to bring you to a current location here, on the other side of the river, Lincoln County is named for General Benjamin Lincoln. He was the commander of the Southern Army at the time, so they decided to name that county after him. So,
1779.
there you go, 1779. So he was doing good, and people did like him there. He just had to surrender in Charleston. But that then quickly brings action coming toward Charlotte from Charleston, because you had I think it's Colonel Buford, Abraham Buford at Waxhaws.
Yeah.
He was from Virginia, and so you have the Battle of the Waxhaws that just on the other side of Pineville and here outside of Mecklenburg County. And just to put that also in context, some of the local history that goes with that is that you have Andrew Jackson and the Jacksons that were out of the Waxhaws too. So, and one of the stories, one of the British officers were telling Andrew Jackson that he wanted him to shine his boots or whatever. He refused, and they took the sword. I got one here, but I'm not going to pull it out. They hit him, and he got a scar across the top of his head that he remembered for the rest of his life. And when I'm going to jump out of the American Revolution, in the Battle of New Orleans, he defeated the British in the War of 1812. So Payback. Exactly. So he never forgot that sword that officer gave him. But the Waxhaws, I think, was a outcry for the local area. And just so you know, the commander of that was a Lieutenant Bannister Tarleton. And most people really don't like Tarleton. I don't think anybody still likes Tarleton. Oh, sorry about that, Hugh. But he did go back to London and England and joined Parliament. And I think he had some contention with some of the folks over there too in Parliament.
At one point, this may not be so, but Thomas Brandon, on his way to basically Ramshore's Mill, he picked up a young man by the name of Andrew Jackson, who was an orphan, and supposedly Jackson was a drummer for Thomas Brandon.
Thank you for that. So you have the momentum coming this way, and that was in the May time frame also after the surrender of Charleston. The next big key point in the story coming this way is Cornwallis comes up to Camden, South Carolina, and the Camden Road went out of Charlotte down to Camden, and one of my other relatives, Peter Meisenheimer, who had a pigeon and survived long enough to record it. And Camden at the time, I know I've got several historians in here, the men actually referred to it as Gum Swamp, because there was a creek there that was called Gum Swamp Creek. And so they were fighting around that. So geography plays part of the original pigeon records that tell that. But like Lynn has said, my Meisenheimer ancestors are from near Mount Pleasant at St. John's Lutheran Church. So, but it was Mecklenburg County at the time. So these were Mecklenburg militiamen that went and fought at the Battle of Camden. And so at that, we should all stand proud, because North Carolina in the Battle of Camden stood its ground, and General Griffith Rutherford was captured and taken prisoner by the British. And the British at that time did have Florida under its jurisdiction. At the end of the French and Indian War, I think 1763, the Spanish had given Britain Florida, and then with the peace treaty of Paris in 1793, the British gave it back to the Spanish. So the British only had Florida for 20 years, but importantly, they had it during the American Revolution. And they would take prisoners down there to St. Augustine, because there was a very nice Spanish fort still there. If you need to go see it, it's very, I think they made it out of coral rock. But they gave General Griffith Rutherford permission to go into the town to find lodging, so he didn't have to sleep in the prison cells, and he had to give his word of honor not to try to escape. But I don't think he wanted to escape from there anyway, because there were a lot of alligators, and he was a long ways from home. So he didn't risk getting eaten alive, so he abided by his little parole to stay in town until he came back. But it is hugely important because from Camden, I mentioned Camden Road, the American general was General Horatio Gates. Now, General Horatio Gates, he decided when he saw that the forces were faltering on the American side that he was going to do a little mini retreat. Let me see, mini. He left Camden. He came to Charlotte. He got a new horse in Charlotte. He decided not to stay in Charlotte because that was still too close to Camden. He rode all the way up to Hillsborough near Durham, and then he said that's where he was waiting for his troops to retreat to him. Not many troops retreated to him. Not many men wanted to. He did not encourage them to support his generalship from that point on. Now, the sad thing is, though, General Horatio Gates was the victor at Saratoga. So, at one point, there was even talk in the Continental Congress about replacing George Washington with General Gates since he had won at Saratoga. So, there was some conversation in the background going on there. But after Camden, he did not have a generalship anymore, or short-lived after that, from August until December. But in between that time period, you have General Cornwallis, who now is on the high road. He is advancing in. Just a brief mention, because I don't want to get into some of the other battles, but they are local and they are of importance. When General Cornwallis is coming this way, you did have the Battle of Ramsar's Mill over in Lincoln County that was put down by the Rowan militia with Colonel Francis Locke, who came over on one of the fords, and that also is going to be depicted on some of the map here I'll be showing shortly.
The celebration is June 8th and 9th this year at Ramsar's Mill in Lincoln.
There'll be probably a reenactment and other celebration. SAR and DAR do a wreath laying and stuff over there. Thank you for that. So that was in the June time frame, but Cornwallis did not want the Loyalists to organize too early. He was not planning on coming into North Carolina until after the harvest season, because what do you need with an army is a way to feed them. And so the corn, the grain, and all that would help feed his army, he wanted to come into North Carolina, because wherever he was, they were constantly consuming supplies. And he needed to come into North Carolina, and he wanted to time it at the right time so that he would have food through the winter. And these skirmishes that took place, battles at the Ramsar's Mill, at Colson's Mill, General William Lee Davidson actually was colonel at the time. He got shot in the stomach, but they were fighting down there. And that was on the Rocky River, and over in the general area over here, Colson's Mill, you've got the connection there. The Kings Road was over there. And so men from Rowan County, Mecklenburg County, all went and supported that, which Colonel Davidson at the time. But he distinguished himself at that point in time, bringing into the equation in June, and then in August, with the loss of General Griffith Rutherford at Camden, the North Carolina Board of War and the governor all selected the replacement to be General William Lee Davidson. the interesting part about that is that he was a Continental soldier. So in my research, he had both dual aspects until he died. So he was both a Continental officer and the general in Congress. They only honored him in the Continental role for paying him a pension. He was a colonel. Otherwise, they would have been paying him being a general, and that would have been distributed to the heirs. So they gave him the lower rank, but they said, well, he's a Continental soldier. So, you know, federal government. Anyway, so that's why that kind of did play into that. But you have a lot of momentum and everything building and coming up this way. Charlotte was in the letters of General Cornwallis, Lord Cornwallis. He was designating Charlotte to be an outpost, a permanent outpost. When he was at Camden, they built a permanent outpost there. There are actually still foundation ruins to the magazine where they would store the powder that were there that they built out of brick, and they had plenty of readouts and stuff there. 96 in South Carolina, where there's a star fort, that was another location that the British held, and so the British strategy to be effective and to work the way that the General Clinton intended it for was to build outposts and strategically move methodically, slowly through the country and seize the area, not to chase green, which is what he ends up doing. But so he is doing what he was under orders to do in South Carolina and advancing up into North Carolina. And so you've had the Colson's Mill, you've had Ramsey's Mill, you've had the Battle of Camden and Charlotte. So you get into September timeframe, and Cornwallis is coming into Charlotte, and he's confronted by some of the militia that are local here. You have Davies, William R. Davies, Richardson Davies, who is General Davidson is here, and he pulled out of Charlotte, going up Highway 29 up towards the university area. So he was in the rear guard, basically, with some troops here. Now they really did surprise the British, because they did not expect them to take as fierce a stand as they had done. But the courthouse at that time for in Charlotte was in the square. And so you can go to Lincoln and a lot of these other smaller towns, and they have those circles around the courthouse, because literally the courthouse was. Charlotte grew, and we decided not to keep our courthouse in the square, but that's where it was. And it had a rock wall that was built around the base of it. So that gave the militiamen a way to defend themselves, not have to worry about getting shot up too badly. Plus, the main issue was Tarleton. And I do want to say, a lot of historians present day refer to him as Bloody Tarleton, but if you go back to the American Revolution, they never called him Bloody Tarleton, correcting a myth that goes there. They did call him the Butcher. They did say Tarleton's Quarter, because at the Battle of Waxhaws, the white flag went up, and they continued to massacre them. There's a mass grave buried down there. So Tarleton's Quarter means no quarter at all, if you translate the meaning there. So Tarleton's Quarter or the Butcher, but that's what they did refer to him. And so he was the bad boy in the equation. I think Cornwallis tried to rein him in, but at the same time, he was very effective. He had 250 horsemen in the British Legion that were under his command, and he also had the foot soldiers. At least when he gets to Cowpens Ford, the 23rd Foot are under his command. So he epitomized what everybody wanted to resist. And the Mecklenburg militia that were in Charlotte, looking south down Triumph Street from the courthouse, and the British were advancing up there. And at the time, there were about 24 structures, buildings in Charlotte, what we consider downtown Charlotte today, extending all the way out to where the Wells Fargo building is now, where they had that little kind of courtyard that was right there. And if you go down, there is a monument there that's to Liberty Hall. So they had a school, it was Queen's Museum, I think, at the time. So, and they were also, they used that as the hospital for Charlotte. One of the things that advances from Charleston is they remove the surgeons and the doctors and the medical supplies from Charleston. They do that before it's captured and bring it to Charlotte. And that's key to when General Greene comes to town too. So you have the advancing of the bridge, but the Americans get between the buildings as well as in front of them under the courthouse, and they fire on the British. So they're slammed from all sides, and the British Legion, the cavalry, they retreat, and then they come again, and they're whammed again, and they retreat. And how many times is it? You probably know, Bill. 3 times. So they advance 3 times, and then I think finally Cornwallis has to come out himself, and he's basically saying it's a little bit of a disgrace, you know. And he says, charge them and get them out of there. So finally, they do dislodge the Americans, and they retreat on out Trine Street, and I think they get all the way almost out to the university area. To what's a physical location out there, Bill?
There's a
Monument to Locke, George Locke.
George Locke, Lieutenant George Locke.
Yeah. So
Near where 49 separates from.
right. So it's a pretty good distance. But in between there, you also have, who comes into play later with some of the description I'll be describing, Captain Joseph Graham, who is at the Sugar Creek Presbyterian Church area. And one of the things that you need to understand about part of military tactics, they didn't necessarily want to kill you, outright. If they wounded you and took you out of the battle, that was part of the strategy. And bayoneting someone with the 3 prongs of the bayonet, it is not a smooth cut, so you can't stitch it up. And I see Liz widget here a little bit. I'm sorry about that, but there's no penicillin, so infection. So part of the thing is, they don't necessarily have to kill you, because germs will get you, and so that was part of the aspect. But Graham was discovered by a local young lady, and I think she took him to her home and nursed him back to health. And this is very important to one of the aspects that I like to talk about later, getting to Cowan's Ford. So you have all these events occurring. Now, Cornwallis does come in and occupy Charlotte. So Charlotte is an occupied city by the British. Now, while he is here, this becomes basically a hornet's nest of rebellion to Cornwallis, because General Davidson basically encircles the whole area. I mean, the Mecklenburg militia, the Rowan militia, because remember, he's the general of the Salisbury Military District. And so you have between the Yadkin River and the Catawba River, Mecklenburg County, and then Rowan County. At the time this was drawn, you basically have Anson County, Mecklenburg County, Rowan County, Tryon County. But I think by I think you said 1779, you have Lincoln County created. You've also got Burke County that's been created.
And that was 1777 was Burke County.
Yeah.
And the Catawba County section, this is too important now, the Catawba County was part of Burke County until 1782.
Right.
And it gets to be a real touchy situation with some people, some historians.
Right.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. You have a limited number of counties, but all of these are part of the Salisbury Military District. So General Davidson has command over this whole territory, and it's reported that he had about 20,000 militiamen under his command at the time. You have the Battle of Charlotte, which ensued there. And then you also have the skirmish that takes place out Beatty's Ford Road that leads to McIntyre's Farm. And I actually got some pictures of a monument from McIntyre's Farm up here. And what's quite interesting, and I know they put the hornet's nest on that monument, but it was a bunch of bees, and there were, I think, 12 American patriots and 1,000 bees that defeated 1,000 British soldiers that day. One of the British officers was in such a panic because when they started getting stung by the bees, and I think probably the Americans probably spaced themselves out, probably in a big circle around them, the 12 men, so they were shooting and probably constantly moving from tree to tree, fighting Indian style, to make it feel like there was a bigger presence, because that was part of the strategy, to confuse and the officer rode his horse 11 miles from McIntyre's Farm, out Beatty's Ford Road, back to the square of Charlotte. And horses were running. They were running until they actually died. And the horse fell dead on the square of Charlotte. Mm-hmm. Cornwallis says, "Where are your men?" And he said, "I left them back at the battle back there." 1,000 bees, 12 Americans defeated the British that day. They were on their way out to the farm at Rural Hill that you had mentioned earlier. It was Major John Davidson's. Very, very key location. And it's important that the British never got there, because he's the first millionaire of Mecklenburg County when you consider how much land he had and the resources that he had at his disposal. And so he becomes very important when green comes to town. So you have to realize that that is fundamental and key, that they didn't get everybody's goods, but they tried to get as many. But the Americans, the British say that every time they sent out a foraging party, because remember they had to feed their army, that they would come under attack. They were constantly under attack in Mecklenburg County every time they went out. And so they couldn't go out in parties of, 5, 6, 10. The Americans would capture them or kill them. So they had to go out in hundreds to go out foraging to collect food. You got to feed an army, and that's fundamental. So, that was part of the equation there. And so there was also another little battle that took place at Polk's Mill, which I think is, it's on the opposite side, the west side of the 77. I think it's at, is it called, there's a park over there, Revolutionary Park. I think it's in that general vicinity. If you look that up, it's over in that area on one of the creeks. But the British who had occupied that, they were grinding mills. They were doing it 24 hours a day. If I think isn't that what they were doing, Bill? They were working constantly around the clock because they were collecting the grain, because they had to have that. And they were taking beef cattle, and so you had an army. You had to feed them. So that was a real component of what was going on. And so the Polks were involved. Thomas Polk, Cornwallis, he stayed in Thomas Polk's house. In recent history, within the past 100 years, E.O. Baxter Davidson, who is a descendant of Major John Davidson from Rural Hill, he owned the property where Bank of America building is downtown, because that's where Thomas Polk's house was. And he liked to write that he lived at the headquarters of Cornwallis. And he was the president of Sons of the American Revolution from Mecklenburg Chapter. But he had always put on his letterhead that Cornwallis headquarters. But that's where he really did live. And he took the step that was there and moved it out to Rural Hill. So if you ever want to go step on a step that Cornwallis stepped on, you can go out to the cemetery at Rural Hill. Hugh, I took you out there to see that. And Hugh Dossett, he's from England, everybody. I really do like English, so he's a good friend of mine. So I don't want anything that I say tonight to be offensive to Hugh, my friend there. But he's a very good historian. He teaches at CPCC. A little credit there. Thank you, Hugh. And so, he loves hearing me talk to him. Thank you, Hugh. But the step that Cornwallis stepped on from the Polk House is out there at Rural Hill. So if you ever want to go visit that, step on it, you can. It's in the cemetery, in the Rockwall Cemetery out there at Rural Hill. So there's a lot of interesting history there.
Yeah, there's a rock on the north side of the Court Square in Lincoln, And that it was at the battlefield where Cornwallis and Tarleton camped, and Tarleton took his meals there and his tea there, and of course Tarleton was on the outs with Cornwallis, and they didn't get along too well because of some other things. But the DAR had actually cut off part of that rock and moved to the north end of the court square. So if you come up on in June, I'll be glad to show you where that rock is located.
Thanks, Ron. In Charlotte, you get to the time period of October the 7th, and everyone knows October 7th, that they know American Revolutionary War history is key and very important. And I know that Bill Anderson has worked on some of the history with that as well. And we actually have some of the local troops, I think, from Lincoln County. If there are any others from South Carolina too, that will
Came through Mecklenburg County.
Came through Mecklenburg County is one of the most interesting things, because most of the people who talk about the history of Kings Mountain, here's a picture of Kings Mountain by Nance. They think of the over-the-mountain men that travel down from the Watauga area and from the all the way up in the mountains, and from up in Virginia, you have Campbell and Shelby and many of the other colonels. There was no general involved in the Battle of Kings Mountain, and it is the most interesting aspect to the battle, because they came down from the Quaker Meadows, but then you have Mecklenburg County, you have troops from down here in the South Fork, is that right also? That then they crossed over at Tuckasegee Ford. Tuckasegee Ford is where I-85 crosses the Catawba River. If you look up north, you will see Sadler's Island. And if you actually want to see the ford, you can still see the roadbed for the ford if you travel over to the Whitewater Center. And you go into that property, and you go to the right of the Whitewater Center, and you go down. There's a ditch. It looks like a big ditch, but it's actually the washout of what the roadbed was. And part of the Whitewater Center, the Rapids part, was part of the road itself. They used that and just concreted it in, Hugh, but then they filled in for the walkway. But if you keep going to the edge of the woods, you can walk down a trail that'll take you to the river's edge. Now, one of the important things about the battle, when General Greene comes here, he commissions that they build some fortification down there. There is still an extent fortification that's about 15 feet high that is still down there. I don't know if I mentioned that to you, Hugh, but I'd love to show that to you sometime as well. I brought it to the attention of Dan Morrow at the Historic Landmarks and Stuart Gray, and Stuart Gray has gone out there and has confirmed that it was man-made, and has some archaeologists that are going to be looking into that to kind of date it to see if it was Revolutionary War period. In my soul, I believe that it was, but you've got to get archaeologists to say that it was for sure.
And the ford is named after the road, not the other way around. The road went all the way up to the Tuckasegee River up western North Carolina.
Right, to the Tuckasegee River, that's right. And it came all the way into Charlotte, and it passes by Johnson C. Smith coming into Charlotte, and connects into Trade Street. Is that right? I think I'm right on that. Yeah. So you went from Charlotte all the way up to the ford, and then on west. But you have them traveling in the South Fork boys and South Carolinians. I think it was some of, wasn't it, Sumter had some men that was in there too. Yeah. And so they came back up here, and I've been working with Bill Anderson, he's another good friend of mine, on tracing a lot of these fords and finding the exact locations of them on the Catawba River, and being able to locate that the Beatty's Ford, because Lake Norman covers up a lot of stuff, and trying to find out where things were exactly is kind of hard to do. But last September, I found I look at old maps, but modern maps that are a fishing hotspot map. Last September, I saw the islands underneath the river, and Bill knows I've got a map here at Cowpens Ford and Beatty's Ford, but there are three major islands on the Catawba River that span about a 4.5 to 5 mile distance. But those islands are visible under a fishing hotspot map, which revealed to me where Beatty's Ford Road was. If you go up I-77 and you turn on Brawley School Road and you take it all the way to the end, you end up at Songbird Lane, and that is where on the east side Beatty's Ford goes. And if you look across the river, you will see Governor's Island, and I believe that's where General Cornwallis was, on the Governor's Island, and he came up past the Unity Presbyterian Church to come across there. And we've actually been able to overlay the modern map with a 1938 map, and we can actually see the old roadbed, and you can kind of plot it out and see that.
Just briefly, I can give John a plug here because people wanted to know where Cheryl's Ford was on the Catawba River. So we tried to find, well, let's go and find the oldest maps we can possibly find and to see if we can resolve it that way. But John had the genius of pulling out a modern fishing map, just a fishing map, and found the islands where Cheryl's Ford was.
And Beatty's Ford. So, thank you, people. Thank you. But the confusing part about that too is that you have Beatty's Ford Bridge that was built a mile below the actual Beatty's Ford where the islands were. So if you plot old Highway 73, you're in the middle of the lake and there is no landmass. So if you face Beatty's Ford Road on the old 73, you miss the mark. And so that's one of the things Bill is bringing out, because on one of the maps I was able to pinpoint for him, you got it in the wrong location. It wasn't that it was wrong, it was called Beatty's Ford Bridge. And so logically you would think that's where it was, but that's not where it was. And underwater, I don't scuba dive, so I can't go verify it, but that's the fishing map brought that out. So, but you have Beatty's Ford, and I bring Beatty's Ford into the equation because I think was it Beatty's Ford or Cheryl's Ford where the men that went to Kings Mountain from this area crossed over? Was it Beatty's Ford?
Well, it's just a small detail, but they crossed back to the west at Beatty's Ford, then went up to Cheryl's Ford.
And then went to Cheryl's Ford, but they were on the west side, so they touched both locations. And Cheryl's Ford is above Highway 150 on the right side. Actually, if you go to the Lake Norman State Park, you have to get off at Troutman, and you can go all the way into there to the property, and there's a little campground that you can park, and there's a little peninsula. If you go down to that little peninsula, you can look out about 150 yards, there's a little island, and Cheryl's Ford crossed on the other side of that island, and crosses the islands that I found under the fishing map spot. So just so you know, if anyone goes looking, you can actually go and be pretty close to it and see what the area looked like. But so Cornwallis is in Charlotte, coming back to Charlotte. Got to come back to Charlotte all the time because that's the key to a lot of what happens around here. You have men coming from over the mountains. You have men coming from down in the Lincoln County, South Carolina area that travel up and come back to. They were trying to rendezvous near Quaker Meadows, but I think they had already started down towards Gilberttown, and then they all finally meet up at Cowpens. Cowpens plays another role later in another battle, but they decide there, if I'm not mistaken, to pick their best men, ones that are healthy and the best shots. They have 1,000 horses, and you have Patrick Ferguson that is over at Kings Mountain. They discover where he is, and so they put their best men. They ride through the night, through the rain, to the next day, and they arrive, what is it, in the afternoon, about what time?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock. And they don't have one leader, so they basically tell all the men, you're your own commander, in a sense. Isn't that right, Bill? And they were, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they were intending to attack from one side to draw the attention of the British to the one side, but they actually simultaneously attacked from all sides. And so you have on the horse in the picture here, Ferguson, and he's wearing a red and white check shirt. I think is the way they were able to identify him. And anyway, the British like to fight in the 18th century warfare with a frontal assault. because they can line all their men up, they can shoot volleys, and but when you have an encompassed mountain, you can't defend that as well as you think you can if you're attacked from all sides. And I think that was part of the downfall. Would other historians in here? Okay, so and the weapons. A brown bess musket is smooth bore, and so there's no rifling to it. If you are level, you're good, but on a mountain, you're pointing down. I'm just wondering how many musket balls rolled out of the barrel of those guns and didn't have any effect at all except for puffs of smoke. Just saying. But the militia that were surrounding them all had rifles, and these guys were marksmen that could shoot from that and hit their mark up to 250 to 300 yards. Is that about right? And brown bess muskets had a range only of 80 yards. So the Americans could be out of range of the British, who were also losing their musket balls at the same time they were being shot at. So there was really a disadvantage to being on top of that mountain. And Patrick Ferguson, I think he made one big mistake. People believe in divine providence and God. He said, not God Almighty cannot remove me from the top of this mountain. God left him there. He's buried with one of the young ladies that was there with him. I think she got a musket ball too, unfortunately. But the other one, I think, came back and reported to Cornwallis and Charlotte what had happened over there. Well, this major battle, because a lot of people consider that kind of a turning point of the American Revolution. These are two pictures because it was definitely hand-to-hand combat that was going on over there. Cornwallis lost his western flank, because that's who Patrick Ferguson was, and protect that side from the mountains. So he immediately retreated out of Charlotte. I mean, he left wagons and all kinds of stuff, some supplies, trying to get out of Charlotte in such confusion, because he didn't know where these men were going to come from and attack. They just wiped out one whole army of his over there in October the 7th at Kings Mountain. So, I mean, he retreats back down to Winsboro in South Carolina, and from some of the letters and information that I've been able to read down there, because South Carolina, pretty much the whole state, and I'm not saying there weren't pockets, because you have Francis Marion and other Andrew Pickens and some, but they were not in concentrated force. They were dispersed throughout the area. So the British pretty much held the majority of South Carolina under their control and sway. Pretty much acted on that point there. And so, but this turns the tide. Now, unfortunately, the Every Mountain men did not stay in force as an army. They went back home. So you then advance to the point in this time frame that Congress wised up that they had lost the battle at Charleston. They lost the battle at Camden. The two generals, Lincoln was captured by the British, and Gates hightailed it back up to Hillsborough. So now they had to finally realize that they were not good at picking generals to fight in the South. So they turned to George Washington. Finally, and George Washington said, General Greene, send Greene south. He's been with me this whole time. And General Greene, part of what he did with Washington was he was the commissary general and for supplies and everything. Well, at Camden, they had lost all the wagons, all the supplies that Gates had assembled. I mean, he took them right down to the battle with him, and he just handed Cornwallis all the supplies of the Continental Army, and he had already captured Charleston, so they'd already captured all their supplies. So the South was decimated of supplies. And so, you know, it looked like the British were just going to roll up South Carolina and North Carolina. At this point, they were on a high tide. And that's why you have the guys that go to Ramser's Mill that are saying, look, because they think the British are going to win. I mean, it really does look like that. So you have to really realize that when Greene comes down after meeting with Congress and they say kind of formulate a plan and come on down. He's having to recruit supplies and everything to send them down through here. And he gets to Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson tells him he needs to build boats on wheels to bring supplies down the major rivers. You got the Yadkin River and you got the Catawba River, and in Salisbury is right up here where the trading ford is, and there's actually a road. This map from 1775 shows you the road that goes all the way across over to Oliphant's Mill. Oliphant's Mill is where Cheryl's Ford is. And so they were thinking, because they were looking at the maps up there in Virginia too, trying to figure out, well, how do we get supplies down into Mecklenburg County and Charlotte? Because this is where they want to draw the line to defend, since the British are down in South Carolina, they're trying to draw the buffer line to keep North Carolina from being invaded. Because that's the whole emphasis of what Greene is trying to do now when he comes into Charlotte. But he comes across and stops in Salisbury. And a lot of the research that I've been doing in the papers on General Greene, which is in several volumes like this, but between the time frame of December the 1st, when he gets to Salisbury, to February the 1st, with the Battle of Cowpens Ford, there's only one footnote reference that he makes to Guilford Courthouse. Between that time span, pretty much all his emphasis is routing supplies, routing troops, and everything through Salisbury. If you look at the map, you can see that the wagon road right up in here is near Concord, which is Fikers, and down in here is Charlotte, and then this is kind of the Camden Road that I was talking about there. But over here, off of the Yadkin, you have these two roads that are coming down, going up to Salisbury, and they come across here, and this here down is Sherall. But on the other side, on the east side, is Marlborough, and that is where Greene moved his camp after coming to Charlotte. He comes to Charlotte since it's already been depleted from the British taking all the supplies of food in Charlotte. Greene decides that what he wants to do is he's focusing on trying to bring Cornwallis to battle in Salisbury. That he's already said in one letter that he has fields of glory for Salisbury. But he comes to Charlotte and he meets with all the local leaders here, Thomas Polk and many of the other, Major John Davidson. He commissions John Davidson to build these boats on wheel at Rural Hill. There's actually a letter that General Davidson writes to General Morgan and says the boats on wheels are at Major Davidson. So these are the boats that, in the end, Greene uses to escape across the country and maneuver Cornwallis as they're being pursued across the country. But you have that angle there. But General Greene writes an important letter to George Washington. He says, what kind of military strategy do you suggest for me to do down here? And General Washington basically writes him back and says, you figure it out. And so he comes up with the idea and writes back to General Washington, will you approve me creating a flying army? And that is real fundamental and key. And I think it's based on Kings Mountain, because he's writing folks about Kings Mountain, trying to learn about Kings Mountain. Kings Mountain is where they took the men from Cowpens and put them all on horse and went to the battle. So he realizes all this vast territory that he's got to control and maneuver, he can't manage it with population dispersed as much as it is. So he's got to have men on horses. He cannot have foot soldiers. So he puts it in his orders once he's approved by General Washington to create his flying army. And so if you understand this concept, then you can start to understand part of the strategy that Greene is doing here. So he doesn't have just 2 armies, he has 3 armies, because everybody discounts the militia, but the militia he's equipping to be a flying army. So he divides when he comes to Charlotte, and he takes command on December the 3rd. Now, for Charlotte's history, December the 3rd should be internationally proclaimed, because his taking command here changes the whole dynamics of the Southern campaign and ends up resulting in Cornwallis going to Yorktown and surrendering. So Charlotte should be internationally acclaimed on December the 3rd. If I get to put a plug and build an event out of that, I would. That's because I'm green. Yes. Well, I would say that. So, anyway. But he comes here, he meets with Polk, he meets with all the other militia leaders, Major John Davidson, General Davidson. You have Morgan, General Morgan here. Who else are some of the noted officers here? Bill, do you remember? There's a couple other generals, I think.
Gage
Lee
was here until he left, soon after Morgan arrived.
Yeah.
Graham, Colonel Graham was here, William Graham, Joseph McDowell was here,
Yep.
and Joseph Graham was here also.
Mhm.
So, and William David, that's one that really needs to be brought out. William David was a heck of a man.
Right, right. And I mentioned him because he was at the Battle of Charlotte, but he does, I think Green wanted him to be his commissary in North Carolina to get supplies. He really wanted to be in the forces and fighting, but he did take over that. I'm getting a couple of nods back here, so I know I'm on the right point there. Okay. She's giving me some time. Okay, so I'm going to try to go super fast. So, Charlotte, the Continentals are divided to Straw and go over west with Morgan. Morgan ends up in having the Battle of Cowpens on January the 17th. Now, I believe that this is kind of pre-planned, that Morgan was going to retreat to Sherrill's Ford, because Sherrill's Ford at Oliphant Mill, and the letters was created as a magazine where there were supplies and everything. So Morgan takes the same mountain roads that the Everett Mountain Men came down to go back, cross over at Morganton, go to Maiden, and send the prisoners up across this. That's Island Ford. And Bill, I'll show you. I got a map with the big island of Island Ford that you haven't seen. I know you want to see that. And cross there. Morgan got to Sherrill's Ford at January the 23rd. January 23rd, he arrives at Sherrill's Ford. And so Cornwallis is still, is he down at below Tryon Courthouse?
He's Tryon Courthouse on 23rd.
And General Green is still over here at Sherrill on the 25th. So you start having elements. He finds out on the 25th that the victory at Cowpens took place over here. And a rider had to come. It took him from the 17th to the 25th to notify him.
And Morgan and his main army came down the Tuckasegee Road, and he sent the prisoners of William Washington up around to Morganton, and they came down Old 18 to the State Road,
Okay.
and then went at Maiden, they called the Island Ford Road.
Okay. Island Ford, yeah. So what you then have is the plan to kind of bring all the elements to Salisbury, because he wants to bring a junction of all his troops there. But the Catawba River becomes the key element here, because through research that Bill Anderson and I have put together, we have discovered that in the letter that Cornwallis wrote, the Americans had covered 40 miles of the river. If you look from Charlotte to Tuckasegee up to that straight line to where it crosses the Catawba River, that black line, that is, and actually, Bill, the island is under Lookout Shoals Lake, so now it does measure 40 miles. Because before I was telling him it was 39.5 miles, it's 40 miles, to be accurate with Cornwallis's letter, from I-85 to I-40, and at all the fords. Tuckasegee, Tools Ford, which is near Roll Hill, they built a fortification there, to Cowan's Ford, to Beatty's Ford. There is a ford that's McEwen's Ford, whether there were troops there or not, or whether they had it blockaded. I think there may have been some blockading going on there. To Sherrill's Ford, to Island Ford. That whole area was blockaded, and Cornwallis was starting to sweat, because when he gets to Lincolnton, he decides to burn his wagons, because he realizes the forces that are mounting, and he gets intelligence that Greene has come across country to meet with Morgan at Sherrill's Ford. On January the 31st, General Greene, General Davidson, General Morgan William Washington. Suspect, maybe Pickens arrived there sometime, whether he was in the meeting or not. He did arrive there to Ford, according to pension records. It says he got to Beatty's Ford in advance of Cornwallis. So, but they were having a meeting. They looked at each other. Cornwallis came to the Catawba River after leaving Jacob Forney's house on the other side, which is Ingleside today on Highway 73, and they faced off at each other. They looked at binoculars and everything. Well, there was a massive amount of Americans there. Cornwallis wasn't going to cross the river at 2 o'clock in the afternoon because he would have been, all his men would have been decimated, picked off by the long rifles. They could shoot 300 yards. The Catawba River was anywhere from 400 to 500 yards. The British would have never made it across the river on January the 31st of 1781. Cornwallis does a favorite strategy, and I think that anticipated by Greene and Davidson, because they were both in the Battle of Brandywine up in Pennsylvania, and they faced off across the river with Cornwallis at that battle also. So the river and the crossing had a very similar event that all three of these generals had experienced before, and they knew that the British would want to split their forces. That is why Davidson went to Cowpens Ford, took troops. We're saying somewhere, Bill thinks probably about 500. I'm getting pensioners that are putting me at a number somewhere up to 800 to 900 troops. So, but he does take a force to Cowpens Ford. Here's what happens at Cowpens Ford on February 1st. There's a fog. There's a fog. Joseph Graham mentions it in his book. Robert Henry mentions it in his book. And I find several pensioners that mention the fog. They cannot see across the river. The advantage of being on a high hill on the river with 500 yards open water to shoot at the enemy is you got to be able to see the enemy. They didn't see the enemy. Robert Henry goes down to the edge of the water, he splashes water in his face, and he says, you know, is it a mirage? Is it really the British? And it is. But they hear them, and they're probably within 50 yards of the riverbank. So now the advantage, there is a surprise by the British on the Americans, and Davidson comes racing down to the river's edge, and the skirmish ensues there. I have a letter from Greene that he doesn't know that Davidson is killed until approximately February the 3rd. He is still anticipating that Greene or Davidson is coming to him, but Davidson does a little bit of a retreat. One account that I have found puts him at about 100 yards to 150 yards from near his camp where he is killed. We could get into a debate who shot him, whether it was Frederick Hager, Dick Bill, or some of the Germans under the von Boos, because there was some German that was being spoken in one of the pension records that he said he heard German when the shot went off. They killed him. Frederick Hager was German, so was it the individual or was it the army? We don't know. Davidson is killed. This is what changes the whole dynamics of trying to get everybody to Salisbury, because General Greene needs Davidson, badly needs Davidson, needs the militia. General Greene on February 1st is at Sherrill's Ford with Morgan. He doesn't leave there until about 10 or 11 when he orders the retreat to go to Salisbury. He's still trying to get everybody to Salisbury. The attack by Tarleton at Torrance's Tavern about 2 o'clock on February 1st, where there is assembled anywhere from 600 to 800 militiamen, wipes out the militia coming to the support of General Greene. So the idea of getting the militia to join up with the Continental troops in Salisbury falls apart. So then Greene has to use boats on wheels built by General Davidson locally here to get across the Yadkin River at the trading ford and then race on to the Dan River to get out of the reach of Cornwallis, to resupply, to come back. And coming this weekend, if you go to Guilford Courthouse in Greensboro, you will see the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which General Greene comes back and gives battle to Cornwallis. And even though it is a British victory, it is a hollow British victory, because in Parliament they said that another such victory, we will lose the war. And Cornwallis leaves North Carolina, goes to Wilmington, goes to Virginia, and you know the rest of the story.
Thank you, John.
That was a race.
Wow, yeah. That's,
There's a lot to cover.
yeah. That was great. I'm impressed.
You already did half of it, too.
I know. I think we could be here quite a bit longer if we really
I got
wanted to.
just a quick question. Have
Yeah.
you ever found a replica, or have they ever found any of those boats on wheels buried anywhere?
There's a written.
Or is there a drawing of them?
I don't know. That'd be a good question. I don't know if Bill's come across that. I think there's a written description because Thomas Jefferson, I think, kind of gave the creative invention of the idea to him. They were used mainly to get supplies, but I think as the victory at Cowpens and when Greene was at Cheraw, there was a flood that raised the river about 30 feet. And then when he realized how massive the currents from these rains, just like at Florence and Michael when they took place, he realized he needed these boats to go with the army to transport the soldiers across. They were flat and had wheels is the best description I know to give you.
There are various artistic representations of it. Now, whether to what degree they're based on actual drawings from that era, I'm not certain about that. But there
Cool.
are
I've never heard of
artistic
that.
representations of boats on wheels.
They're kind of flatbed boats.
Yeah. There was a TV Western where a guy had put a sail on a boat and would actually ran a race and beat some horses with that. Well, anyway, that's TV.
That's great, yeah.
But
Wow.
everything's centered around Charlotte to try to do this. And General Davidson being right there with the Royal and Mecklenburg Militia is the Third Army that a lot of people kind of
Just
miss.
don't know.
Because when he called them up, and Bill probably kind of remembers, he said 6 weeks service for 3 months pay. And that was the emergency call of the Flying Army up because he didn't have to keep them in camp, he didn't have to feed them, he didn't have to take care of the horses or their guns. They had to come with a 10-day supply of food, bring your own weapon, and you have to be on horse. No one can come on foot to join the Flying Army. And so that is how they were able to get from the 25th of January or the 23rd of January when Morgan got there and started ordering troops up to encompass 40 miles of the Catawba River in 10 days.
We could go on all night.
Yeah,
but
no.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, John. And it's fascinating to hear all of these places that we all currently know, and drive by every day and how they played really critical roles in the American Revolution. So thank you. John obviously knows so much. We are lucky to have all these other folks together. What a great way to represent everything and remember the Revolution, whichever side you're on. Right?
We're friends today.
That's right.
We were in World War I, World War II. We're
And
friends.
by the way, John is putting together a book that he is writing based on having all the research he's done looking at old pension records from both the veterans and the widows. So he's going to have a lot more to offer in book form in the future. So thank you very much, John. We really appreciate it. And you're, I'm sure, welcome to talk to John afterwards. Just to let you know what's happening next month, we're going to have Linda Blackwelder, who has just written a book about the Steel Creek area, southwest area of Mecklenburg County. She's done many years of research, done an extensive history, and has written a wonderful book that she's going to talk about next month. That's April 10th. So we hope you can join us then. Feel free to have some more refreshments and come back and see us next month. We're adjourned.